Hello, I'm Professor Frank Askin of the Rutgers Constitutional Litigation Clinic, and you're watching North Shore Magazine.
Welcome to North Shore Magazine. I'm your host, Fred Hadley, and today we have a very special guest, and that would be Professor Frank Askin of the Constitutional Litigation Clinic at Rutgers University. How do you do, Professor?
Good afternoon.
How are you, sir?
Okay, just fine.
Okay. In doing a little research on your book, I came upon an interesting quote from Congressman John Conyers, who said that your book, which is called Defending Rights, it said, "The book belies the adage that people who love law and sausages should never watch either of them being made." Now, of course, we all know about sausages, but why shouldn't people watch laws being made, and why does your book give the lie to that?
Well, because it's supposed to be very I think it was Churchill who originally made that statement, or maybe even before Churchill. But it's a pretty unruly process. It's hard to follow. It gets strange rules and proceedings. But I guess he's saying that it sort of brings it alive.
Right.
It makes it more My book helps make it more understandable what goes on in behind the scenes in the legislative process.
Right.
Because I worked for John Conyers for a few years.
Sure. Now, speaking of sausages, the sixth season of The Sopranos has just begun.
Right.
I don't know whether or not you're a fan of the show.
I watch it. I won't say I watch it religiously, but I do try to keep up with it as much as I can.
Now, of course, that show is all about people that are either convicted felons or actively engaged in performing felonies. And I understand that looking back at your work in the past, that you've advocated that felons should be allowed to vote. Can you tell us a little about why you feel that way?
Well, I've advocated that felons on parole and probation should be allowed to vote.
Right. But
I must tell you, you bring that up at a very sore moment because yesterday the New Jersey Supreme Court denied our appeal. We lost that in the appellate division. And yesterday, the New Jersey Supreme Court denied our petition for certification in that case. So we've lost that issue. But on the other hand, persons who are parolees and probationers are in the community. They're working side by side with their neighbors. They're supposed to be being rehabilitated and being part of to be mainstreamed and made good members of the community. That means they should have the right to vote. Why should they be pariahs? And they can't vote while their neighbor next door, who are their workmate next in the next workplace, can vote. So I just think it's appropriate that these people be allowed to vote. I find it very. The whole is this question of, and most importantly, it's the racial impact of these laws that I think are most discouraging. Everybody knows that in many states like New Jersey, the great majority of persons in prison, and therefore on parole, are minorities. And it's very interesting that there are two states in this country which allow even prisoners to vote. And who are they? Maine and Vermont. And think about the racial composition of those two states, and you get some idea maybe of what's behind this notion that people convicted of crimes shouldn't be able to vote at all. Some states you can't vote forever.
Right.
New Jersey's not the worst, nor is it the best. It's sort of in the middle. You can vote once you're off parole and probation.
Right.
In states like Florida, they disfranchise you even if you have the same name as someone who was once convicted of a felony.
Yeah.
So, and a lot of, the southern states, of course, are worse. And again, that gives you some idea of what's behind these laws.
Now, do you anticipate taking this to the federal level?
No. This was that case was strictly again under the state constitution, because I have no faith that this U.S. Supreme Court will. Chief Justice Rehnquist began the late Chief Justice Rehnquist began his political career keeping Hispanics from voting in Phoenix, Arizona. And he spent his years on the bench also trying to keep minorities from voting, as far as I'm concerned, and created some very bad federal law on this point. So I see very little help coming from the federal courts on this issue.
Now, Professor, again, you've devoted a good portion of your life to defending the Constitution and free speech and rights and everything. And, of course, we're now in a totally different environment in this country post 9/11. And there's a lot of sentiment toward restricting personal rights in favor of national security and anti-terrorism. Do you feel that your work has become complicated or less, shall we say, popular, because it could almost be construed as anti-patriotic? Could you comment on the post-9/11 environment as it relates to constitutional?
Yeah, it's certainly not a good environment. There's a lot of sentiment for, there's a lot of good, proper concern over terrorism and the threat of terrorism. And it can often be used as a smokescreen for taking people's rights away. I don't deny that there have to be some measures to try to combat terrorism, the threat of new 9/11s, but I just think it's up to the government to justify that these are really necessary, and that the cure won't be worse than the disease. Right. And that's and the worst thing about all these new rules, Patriot Act, NSA spying, is that they've done away with checks and balances in judicial review. I mean, our Constitution is based on the notion of separation of powers, checks and balances, judicial review, that we're a government of laws, not of men. Well, this administration is turning that on its head. They're saying, forget the laws. George Bush and Dick Cheney will protect you. They don't even want the judges they appoint to have any oversight. It's outrageous. I'll give you an example. Right up of what this means when you don't have judicial oversight. I'm going back to the McCarthy era now and the post-McCarthy era. Joe McCarthy. And I had a case of a high school student, 15-year-old high school student, who was investigated by the FBI because she wrote a letter for a homework assignment to the Socialist Workers' Party. Now, to make a long story short, what happened was her letter was picked up in an FBI national security mail cover. That is, her letter went to the Socialist Workers' Party headquarters in New York. Somebody took off her return address, sent it to the FBI office in Newark, and they sent an agent out in the field. Why is this person named Peyton writing to the Socialist Workers' Party? And they finally wind up at her high school, where they're told, yeah, she's doing a homework assignment. And anyway, the question ultimately became, did they have any, what was the right of the FBI to monitor the mail of the Socialist Workers' Party? And under the postal regulation, there were 3 times that there could be mail covers. 1 was to catch fugitives, 2 was for mail fraud, and 3 was in the interest of national security. To get a national security mail cover, the director of the FBI, all he had to do was certify that it was needed for national security, give that to the Postal Service, and that was stuck in a drawer.
Now, when you say mail cover, could you just define that?
Yeah, they take anything off the outside of the envelope. Don't open the envelope. They take postmarks or return addresses, anything on the outside of the envelope.
So it's sort of be equivalent of like a pen register on a telephone tap? Right.
Anyway, this case lasted 7 years. I finally got the deposition of L. Patrick Gray, the acting director of the FBI who authorized the mail cover. And I made him turn over his original certification. Why was this needed in the interest of national security? And guess what it says? Because the Socialist Workers' Party is actively organizing protests against the war in Vietnam. That's the certification. Now, if you'd ever asked a judge for a warrant, the judge would have laughed him out of court. Most conservative judge would have never issued a warrant based on that. Right. FBI wouldn't even have the chutzpah to ask for a warrant.
Right.
But as long as it's a certification, there's anything they want. It's meaningless. There is no oversight. There is no judicial review. There are no checks and balances. And that's what's wrong with all these new rules that the Bush administration is handing down. We'll take it. Trust us. Nobody can see what we're doing. And that's what it's about.
Professor Askin, referring to the FBI, I read it in the opening pages of your book, Defending Rights, that you became aware of and got possession of a FBI file on yourself.
Oh, yeah.
Can you tell us why that file existed, what it was you were doing, what was your reaction, and so on?
Like I told you, my FBI file started when I was 17 years old because I was a community activist protesting racial segregation in a segregated city. Now, it was not politically correct to be for civil rights back in 1948 or 1949.
Right.
So I have a huge FBI file. I got it later under the Freedom of Information Act.
How surprised were you when you obtained that?
No, I was
Freedom
not
of Information
surprised. I knew it was
in
there.
the 70s, right?
Yeah, I knew it was there.
Right.
I got it in the 70s.
Right.
But I knew the FBI used to follow
How
me
thick
around.
was it?
500 pages.
Wow.
It's 500 pages.
And it had all your addresses, et cetera?
Oh, yeah, everything's in there, and it describes, going to meetings and, letters to the editor and sit-ins and, picket lines and things like that. And there was no illegal activity. It was all activity protected by the First Amendment.
How current was the file? In other words, did it stop at a certain point, or was it ongoing?
Well, it sort of stopped. Well, for 20 years, I was on what's called the Security Index. The Security Index was a product of the McCarthy era, of individuals who in time of national emergency were to be rounded up and put in internment camps. I was on the Security Index from around 1948 to 1968 when I was finally removed. I was already now a lawyer. I was teaching law. But up till then, well, they stopped some active surveillance back in the early 50s.
Were you ever aware that you were being watched?
Yeah, sure.
How could you tell?
Oh, you knew. In fact, the FBI tried to interview me a couple of times. I told them I want to talk to them.
Did they ever notify your relatives, and everybody would call you up and say, hey, there's some couple of guys came over here in suits asking all kinds of questions about you? Did that ever happen?
Yes. Well, what happened when, it's another story. That's where the story begins with my book. When my wife, it was our 25th anniversary, took me on a mystery ride to, I know where we were going, and we go back to her home in the Bronx where we eloped, and then she's driving out to Westchester County, and I see the sign Harrison, New York, and I said, oh, I know what we're doing. We're retracing our elopement. Then we rode around all downtown Harrison, New York, and we didn't see anything that looked familiar. We were married in the living room of the Justice of the Peace's house. We knew his name was Charles? Yeah, right. And we went to the phone book. There was nobody in the phone book by that name list. We went to the police station. They didn't remember Justice of the Peace by that name. Venezia. They couldn't remember Justice of the Peace by that name. And then 6 months later, I'm working on my memoir, Defending Rights, and I come across this FBI memo that says, well, I got married on such and such a day to such and such a person in the living room of Charles Venezia at 6 Calvert Place in Harrison, New York.
Were there any photos in your file? Surveillance photos?
There were an occasional photo, nothing significant, occasional photo, maybe on a picket line or something. And then what I discovered was, I knew how it happened, and I was aware of it, because a few months after we got married, my wife tells me, an old friend of yours called my mother, and they said, we're asking about you, because there had been a notice of our marriage in the New York Times. And, of course, my mother-in-law spent a half hour on the phone telling me all about her wonderful son-in-law, everything they wanted to know. And, of course, the FBI reports it all. And at the time, when my wife told me that a friend from Baltimore had called, I said, that's not a friend from Baltimore, that's the FBI checking up on me. It was part of their annual review, which kept going on, until at least 1967 or 1968, when I was out of law school and practicing law. And there's another interesting memo in my file, actually. In 1961, before I went to law school, I was the executive director of the Democratic Party in Bergen County. I had been a newspaper reporter in Bergen County, and worked for the Democratic Party for the youth campaign. And we had a rally, and John Kennedy was coming in. And there's actually a notice in the file to the Secret Service that they should just be aware that Frank Askin, sees file number blah, 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 is running the youth campaign in Bergen County. Now, it's interesting. If the FBI went to any of the Democratic leaders I was working for in Bergen County, I didn't know it. I was not aware of it. They never mentioned it to me. So, but that was in the file.
Right, right.
So, they kept their eye on me.
Right, right. Have you had any occasion to study the election procedures that are used in these planned communities? The reason why I'm asking is over at North Shore Towers, we had a situation that was very upsetting to many people. What do you feel about the propriety of using a tabulating company that A, does business with the complex because they rent their main office there, and B, that's involved in a romantic relationship and actually living on the premises with a sitting board member?
Well, the second seems much more problematic than the first. I mean, if they're paying normal rent, reasonable rent, I guess they're not getting any special advantage.
Well, that's the other thing, that they were allowed to get $30,000 in arrears on their rent, which certainly creates the impression of interest conflict, or that they might be inclined to look the other way for preferential treatment on the loan.
That certainly sounds like the appearance of impropriety, and does not seem appropriate, and particularly the relationship between the... As far as I know, they're a very reputable agency.
Well, that's why I'm bringing it up to you, because they enjoyed a very good reputation for many years, but it's now under different management. Mm-hmm. Now, the Galaxy election last month, or this month actually, was actually handled by the very same company and the same woman, and the result of that election was that all the incumbents were reelected and none of the opposition. So we're just wondering if there's a pattern here.
And I can't speak to it.
Right. Now, it isn't just co-ops now, is it? It's the whole electoral process. Even the United States, the last two elections have been generally ridiculed for what's happened down in Florida and then again in Ohio. What can be done about this? People are just losing faith in the integrity of elections at the local and the federal level. And
probably there's good reason to lose some faith. I mean, my colleague is now suing State of New Jersey over these electronic voting machines, which we believe are...
Would that be the Diebold?
Well, we're not. They're using Sequoia.
Sequoia?
We believe one, they don't have a paper trail.
Right.
And two, we believe they're insecure.
Right.
Matter of fact, my colleague isn't going back to court tomorrow to finish up these hearings. So there are a lot of problems. There's also a new huge problem that's coming along. I mean, the right wing does everything they can to keep minorities from voting in this country. There's no question about that. Back to William Rehnquist in Phoenix, back in the 60s, when he tried to keep Hispanics from voting. The new gimmick is got to present photo IDs at the polls. In every state now, there's new regulations being pushed forward about got to have photo IDs at the polls, and we know the impact is going to be on minorities and low-income people, fewer of whom have driver's licenses or other photo IDs. And, I mean, the notion that, I mean, there's always this, there's going to be fraud, there's going to be fraud. Well, the real fraud in elections in this country, it seems to me, are the millions of people who are prevented from voting because of various regulations and barriers to voting. And that's the real fraud. And I think it's a constant struggle to stop this kind of barriers to voting. The ACLU has taken on some cases. They challenged the recent Georgia law, which they were actually going to, in Georgia, they're going to make, if you didn't have a driver's license, they're going to make you pay $40 to get a photo ID. I mean, it was a poll tax, which the court held it was a poll tax. They threw it out.
Sure.
But, the right wing is coming up with a lot of ways to try to keep the poor and the minorities from voting, and it's a constant struggle to fight these provisions.
Okay, now I know we're almost at the end of your time, and I was just wondering, just by way of summary, if you could just say something to the residents of Queens, and in particular of North Shore Towers, that would perhaps offer some hope and optimism, just to sort of summarize what's going on. Do you think that we have rosier days in front of us?
Well, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. You got to keep fighting. I mean, I spent 50, 60 years keeping my finger in the dike. And how much progress we made, I'm not sure, but I think things would be a lot worse if there hadn't been people out there constantly battling.
Right.
I mean, I lived through the McCarthy era.
Sure.
It was pretty terrible. Was it worse than now? I don't know. For a lot of people, it probably was worse than now. For people of Middle Eastern background, it's probably worse for them today. They're the real, they get the brunt of a lot of repressive measures. But the McCarthy era was terribly repressive in many, many ways. Somehow we survived that.
Right.
I trust we'll pull through again. If the biggest advantage now that we didn't have back then is we have a very vibrant public interest bar in this country. And it's one of the reasons I spent 36 years running the constitutional litigation clinic here, to teach students to go out and be public interest lawyers. And we do have and that's my greatest accomplishment, I think, is to have trained hundreds of public interest lawyers who are out there trying to protect our liberties. And that's a vibrant force, which I think helps to keep us free in this country.
Very, very good. Well, you're doing a fine job, and we certainly appreciate you giving us this courtesy of your interview. Okay. I want to thank you very much for appearing on North Shore Magazine, and we just wish you to keep up the great work.
Thank you.